The ice was forming wrong, and Vladimir Korobov had maybe 30 minutes before the Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight returned for confirmation photography. He crouched at the harbor edge, watching water crystallize into patterns that looked nothing like the anti-aircraft battery positions he needed to simulate, feeling winter wind cut through his engineer's coat, while his hands worked calculations on paper that kept tearing in the cold. The Germans had photographed the harbor at 1400 hours and would return at 1530 to verify their initial observations. And in the 90 minutes between flights, Korobov had to transform empty ice into convincing military installations that would draw bombs away from the actual defenses 3 kilometers inland. His solution was insane and would probably fail, but failure meant watching Leningrad burn under bombs that should have fallen harmlessly into frozen water. The blockade had been grinding Leningrad for 417 days, and the city was dying in ways that made death seem merciful. Starvation had killed maybe 300,000 civilians already. Cold had taken another 100,000, and German artillery pounded the survivors with methodical precision that suggested the Reich planned to erase the city completely rather than capture it. Soviet defensive positions were obvious from aerial reconnaissance. Anti-aircraft guns positioned near supply depots, radar installations clustered around critical infrastructure, everything arranged according to military doctrine that the Luftwaffe had learned to read from altitude. German bombers hit those positions daily, destroying guns faster than they could be replaced, grinding down Leningrad's defensive capability through attrition warfare that was working exactly as intended. Korobov had noticed the ice formations 3 weeks earlier while conducting harbor surveys for structural integrity. Leningrad's port facilities were frozen solid, unusable for shipping, but still strategically important as observation positions. He had been mapping ice thickness to determine if trucks could drive across the harbor when he saw strange shadows in aerial photographs pinned to the harbor office wall. The shadows came from ice formations that had frozen unevenly, creating ridges and depressions that resembled manufactured structures from altitude. The resemblance was accidental and imperfect, but it triggered an idea that Korobov initially dismissed as desperate fantasy. What if ice could be shaped deliberately to create decoy positions that would deceive German photo reconnaissance? He had brought the idea to his supervisor, a colonel whose face showed the hollow exhaustion everyone in Leningrad carried. The colonel had listened without interrupting, had examined Korobov's rough sketches showing how water sprayed in specific patterns would freeze into shapes resembling artillery installations, had asked 3 technical questions about feasibility and timing. Then he had approved immediate testing, because desperate situations made desperate ideas seem reasonable, because losing anti-aircraft guns to German bombing was definitely happening, while ice deception might possibly work, and the mathematics of blockade warfare made any chance of reducing casualties worth attempting. Korobov had spent 2 weeks experimenting with spray patterns and freezing rates, learning how water crystallized under different temperatures and wind conditions, discovering that ice could be sculpted if you understood the physics governing its formation. He had created small test installations in isolated sections of the harbor, photographed them from building rooftops to simulate aerial reconnaissance, refined his techniques until the ice formations looked convincing from altitude, even when he knew they were fake. The deceptions wouldn't fool close inspection, but German reconnaissance aircraft flew at 3,000 meters, high enough that photographic resolution transformed detail into suggestion, turned precise observation into interpretation that could be manipulated. The concept was simple. Create false anti-aircraft positions on the harbor ice that would draw German bombs away from real installations. The execution was complex. Ice had to be shaped quickly because reconnaissance flights operated on predictable schedules, had to look convincing in photographs, despite being constructed from water and cold, had to withstand scrutiny from Luftwaffe intelligence analysts who examined every pixel of reconnaissance photography looking for defensive changes. Korobov had developed a technique using fire hoses and spray nozzles to create ice ridges that photographed as gun emplacements, had learned to add details like false ammunition boxes and crew positions by spraying water in specific sequences that built up realistic shadows and textures. The first operational test was happening now, this afternoon, with Luftwaffe reconnaissance scheduled to return in 28 minutes. Korobov had 4 teams positioned across the harbor, each team equipped with fire hoses connected to pumps that pulled water from beneath the ice. The teams had practiced the spray sequences until they could execute them efficiently, had learned to work in brutal cold while wearing gloves that made precise hose manipulation nearly impossible. They had 90 minutes to create an entire false anti-aircraft battery complex that would photograph convincingly enough to redirect German bombing runs, 90 minutes to save real positions by making the Luftwaffe waste tonnage on frozen water. Korobov signaled the first team to begin spraying and watched water arc through winter air, flash freezing before it hit the ice, building up layers that would harden into shapes. The physics were working as predicted. Water sprayed at specific angles created ridges with shadows that resembled gun barrels from altitude, created depressions that looked like crew positions, created the irregular geometry of military installations rather than natural formations. But the formations were building slowly, too slowly, and he had 26 minutes before the reconnaissance flight would return, with cameras recording everything his teams created. He ordered all 4 teams to increase water pressure, and the spray patterns intensified, coating the harbor ice with water that froze on contact, accumulating mass faster than his calculations had predicted. The cold was helping, was flash freezing the water into structures more quickly than would have been possible in moderate temperatures. Leningrad's killing winter was becoming an asset, was providing the exact conditions needed to make ice deception work within the compressed timeline German reconnaissance schedules imposed. Korobov felt a moment of bitter appreciation for the cold that was murdering civilians by the thousands, while simultaneously enabling defensive innovations the Luftwaffe hadn't anticipated. The ice formations were taking shape, but looked crude and unconvincing from ground level. Korobov couldn't judge their effectiveness without seeing them from altitude, couldn't know if the shadows and textures would translate into believable military installations when photographed from 3,000 meters. He was operating on theory and small-scale testing, extrapolating from experiments to full operational deployment without certainty that the scaling would work. The margin for error was non-existent. If the deceptions failed to convince German analysts, the effort would be wasted, and real anti-aircraft positions would continue absorbing bombs. If the deceptions succeeded but looked too obviously fake, the Germans might recognize the tactic and begin bombing real positions more aggressively to compensate. 20 minutes until reconnaissance return, and the ice formations were maybe 60% complete. Korobov walked across the harbor checking each position, evaluating shadow angles and texture depth, adjusting spray patterns to create more convincing details. He ordered one team to build up the ammunition storage area simulation, told another to extend the gun barrel ridges, directed the third team to create false crew positions with better definition. The teams worked without complaint, despite frozen hands and exhaustion. Worked because everyone in Leningrad understood that survival meant constant improvisation, meant attempting desperate measures without guarantee of success. 15 minutes. The ice formations were looking more convincing, but Korobov knew he was too close to judge objectively. He climbed to the top of a harbor warehouse, 4 stories up, trying to approximate the angle from which German cameras would capture the installations. From elevation, the deceptions looked better, looked almost plausible as military positions. The shadows were falling correctly. The proportions seemed accurate. The overall geometry suggested organization rather than random ice formation. But almost plausible might not be sufficient to deceive Luftwaffe analysts who studied reconnaissance photographs with professional skepticism, trained to spot exactly this kind of deception. He descended the warehouse stairs and gave final instructions to the teams: add detail to the northern positions, reinforce the shadow depth on the western gun emplacements, create more texture variation to suggest weathering and use. The teams complied with precision born from practice and desperation, spraying water in controlled bursts that built up exactly the features Korobov specified. They were becoming skilled at ice sculpture, at using water pressure and freezing temperatures to create three-dimensional forms that existed only to deceive cameras operating from altitude. 10 minutes until the reconnaissance flight, and Korobov ordered teams to cease work and evacuate the harbor. The ice formations needed time to freeze completely, needed their surfaces to harden into the matte finish that would photograph without suspicious glossiness. Freshwater ice had characteristic shine that might alert German analysts to recent construction, but ice that had frozen hours earlier developed surface textures that looked weathered and established. Korobov was gambling that 10 minutes of freezing would be sufficient to eliminate the obvious newness of his deceptions, gambling that German analysts would interpret the installations as existing positions rather than structures created 90 minutes before photography. The teams withdrew to positions where they could observe without being visible to aerial reconnaissance. Korobov remained at the harbor edge, watching his ice formations harden in winter sunlight, feeling the weight of uncertainty that came with innovations tested under operational conditions. He had done everything his theory and testing suggested would work, but theory failed constantly when confronted with reality's complexity, and the price of failure here was measured in destroyed anti-aircraft guns and dead crews and bombing runs that would kill civilians sheltering in buildings the guns should have protected. He heard the aircraft before seeing it, the distinctive engine note of a Junkers reconnaissance plane approaching from the west. The Luftwaffe flew reconnaissance with boring predictability, using the same flight paths and timing windows because predictability made their intelligence collection systematic and reliable. Soviet defenders had learned to expect reconnaissance flights at specific times and had mostly stopped shooting at them because anti-aircraft fire revealed gun positions, while rarely achieving kills against aircraft flying at maximum altitude. The Germans photographed Leningrad daily, and Leningrad endured the observation because preventing it would cost more than the intelligence loss was worth. The Junkers passed overhead at 3,000 meters, cameras recording everything below in high-resolution detail that would be analyzed in warm offices far from the blockade. Korobov watched it transit the harbor, banking slightly to capture better angles on the installations he had created. The aircraft was photographing his deceptions, along with everything else visible in Leningrad, was collecting data that Luftwaffe intelligence would process into targeting recommendations for tomorrow's bombing raids. Whether those recommendations would include his false positions remained unknown for at least 6 hours, when German bombers would either strike the harbor ice or ignore it as unimportant. Korobov walked across the frozen harbor, examining his work in afternoon light. The ice formations looked crude and obvious from ground level, looked like exactly what they were: water sprayed in patterns designed to create shadows. But from ground level wasn't what mattered. What mattered was how they photographed from altitude, how they appeared in reconnaissance images that would be examined by analysts who had never seen Leningrad, who knew Soviet defensive positions only through photographs and intelligence reports that might or might not be accurate. The deceptions had to convince people who were looking for deceptions, had to pass professional scrutiny from intelligence officers trained to spot exactly this kind of fraud. Night fell, and Korobov remained at the harbor, unwilling to leave before learning if his deceptions would work. The city around him was dark and silent in ways that felt post-apocalyptic, as if Leningrad had already died and he was walking through ruins waiting for confirmation. The blockade had transformed the city into something barely recognizable as human habitation, had stripped away everything except survival instinct and the grinding arithmetic of resource depletion. Food was rationed to starvation levels, Fuel was nearly exhausted, electricity worked intermittently, and the population was dying at rates that made demographic sustainability impossible. The siege had been designed to kill Leningrad through deprivation, and it was succeeding exactly as German planners had intended. Morning arrived with artillery bombardment that was so routine, nobody reacted beyond seeking shelter in positions they had occupied hundreds of times before. Korobov was in the harbor office when the shelling started, listening to impacts that crept closer, then moved away according to patterns only the Wehrmacht understood. German artillery worked systematically, targeting grids rather than specific locations, maintaining pressure without wasting ammunition on confirmed kills. The bombardment was psychological as much as physical, a daily reminder that the Reich could reach into Leningrad whenever it chose, could kill randomly and constantly with resources the Soviets couldn't match. The Luftwaffe arrived at 1000 hours, the same time they bombed most mornings, approaching from the south with formation discipline that suggested experienced crews executing practiced procedures. Korobov watched from the harbor office window, tracking the bombers through binoculars, trying to determine their target selection. The formation banked east, orienting on approach vectors that could indicate multiple possible targets, and Korobov felt his stomach clench with anticipation that was simultaneously hope and dread. If the bombers struck the harbor ice, his deception had worked, but he would have to watch munitions waste themselves on frozen water while real positions remained vulnerable. If the bombers ignored the harbor, his efforts had failed, and the next reconnaissance cycle would provide updated intelligence, showing the deceptions for what they were. The lead bomber released, and others followed in sequence, dropping ordnance that fell through winter air with geometric precision. The bombs were targeting the harbor, were falling toward the ice formations Korobov had created 18 hours earlier, were proving that German intelligence had interpreted his deceptions as legitimate military installations worth destroying. He watched the first bomb impact on the northern ice position, watched the explosion tear through frozen water and produce nothing except crater and spray, watched subsequent impacts walk across the harbor in patterns that would have destroyed actual anti-aircraft batteries if any had existed in the targeted locations. The bombing run lasted 90 seconds and expended perhaps 40 bombs on ice formations that had cost nothing except water and labor. 40 bombs that should have fallen on real defensive positions 3 kilometers inland. 40 bombs that had been redirected by ice sculpture and photographic interpretation. 40 bombs that proved Luftwaffe reconnaissance could be deceived if the deception understood how aerial photography transformed reality into interpretable images. Korobov felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, something closer to grim validation that desperate innovations could sometimes work despite seeming impossible when proposed. The bombers departed, and Korobov walked onto the harbor ice examining the craters. The impacts had destroyed his deceptions completely, had obliterated the formations that had taken 90 minutes to create and 18 hours to harden. But obliteration was success, meant the Germans had committed resources to destroying installations that didn't exist, meant real defensive positions had survived another day through deception rather than armor. He began planning the next cycle. Reconnaissance would return this afternoon, would photograph the cratered ice and draw conclusions about successful targeting, would report that Leningrad's harbor defenses had been eliminated. Tomorrow's bombing would target elsewhere, would move to other installations that could potentially be deceived the same way. The technique scaled, and Korobov spent the next 3 weeks creating false positions across every frozen surface visible to German reconnaissance. He learned to work faster, developed methods for creating convincing deceptions in under an hour, trained teams to execute spray patterns without supervision. The Luftwaffe bombed his deceptions repeatedly, expending hundreds of tons of ordnance on ice formations that existed only to absorb attacks. German intelligence never appeared to recognize the deception systematically. never issued tactical guidance suggesting that harbor ice formations should be suspected as false, never adjusted their targeting protocols to compensate for the possibility that some photographed positions were elaborate decoys. The deception worked because it exploited fundamental limitations in aerial reconnaissance as practiced by the Luftwaffe in winter 1942. German photo analysis relied on identifying defensive positions through visual characteristics, shadow patterns indicating gun emplacements, geometric arrangements suggesting crew positions, textures indicating construction materials. Korobov's ice formations produced those visual characteristics accurately enough to pass analysis by intelligence officers who were examining hundreds of reconnaissance photographs daily, who couldn't scrutinize every installation with sufficient attention to spot subtle anomalies that might indicate deception. The analysts were looking for Soviet defensive changes, and Korobov gave them exactly what they expected to see, channeling their observational attention toward installations designed specifically to be destroyed. The Soviet command recognized the technique's value and ordered Korobov to document his methods for replication at other besieged locations. He spent a week writing technical specifications for ice deception, describing spray patterns and freezing times and shadow geometry with engineering precision that reduced improvisation to reproducible procedure. The documentation was distributed to defensive positions around Leningrad and later to other cities where winter conditions made ice deception operationally feasible. The technique saved an estimated 200 anti-aircraft guns across the blockade's remaining duration, 200 guns that continued defending against air raids because German bombs had been redirected onto frozen water. But the technique had limitations that Korobov documented carefully for commanders who might overestimate its effectiveness. Ice deception only worked in winter, only worked on surfaces large enough to accommodate convincing installations, only worked against reconnaissance that relied primarily on photography rather than human observation. The deceptions wouldn't fool aerial observers flying at lower altitudes, wouldn't survive radar analysis that detected mass differences between real and false installations, wouldn't remain effective if the Luftwaffe adapted their reconnaissance procedures to account for potential decoys. The technique was temporary advantage in an evolving tactical environment, was useful until the Germans learned to counter it, was worth exploiting aggressively during the window when it remained operationally viable. German intelligence eventually identified the deception, but not until spring, when melting ice revealed the crater's locations on empty harbor surfaces. Luftwaffe analysts realized they had been bombing water rather than guns for months, realized that significant ordnance had been wasted on targets that never existed, realized that their reconnaissance photography had been systematically deceived through methods they hadn't anticipated. The revelation prompted changes in German photo analysis procedures, prompted new guidelines for identifying potential deceptions, prompted tactical adjustments that made ice deception less effective in subsequent winters. But the adjustments came months after Korobov's initial deceptions, came after hundreds of tons of bombs had been wasted, came after Soviet defensive positions had survived long enough to matter during critical phases of the blockade. Korobov never learned how many bombs his deceptions redirected or how many lives the technique saved. The arithmetic was impossible to calculate with precision. Bombs that fell on ice might have been dropped on real targets, or might have been held in reserve, or might have altered German tactical planning in ways that cascaded through operations too complex to trace. The technique's value was proven by its replication and its continuation. Despite German awareness, was demonstrated by Soviet commanders continuing to employ ice deception even after the Luftwaffe had adjusted their analysis procedures to account for it. If the technique hadn't been working, it would have been abandoned for other desperate innovations that filled the siege's 900 days. The blockade ended in January 1944, and Korobov survived, one of maybe 600,000 civilians who lived through conditions that killed almost 1 million. He continued working as engineer through war's conclusion, applying ice deception techniques to other defensive situations, developing new methods for deceiving German reconnaissance as technology and tactics evolved. His innovations saved positions and lives in quantities that military historians would later attempt to quantify through analysis of German bombing records compared to Soviet defensive casualties. The estimates varied widely, but suggested that ice deception prevented somewhere between 300 and 800 defensive position losses across its operational deployment. After the war, Korobov returned to civilian engineering work and rarely spoke about his wartime innovations. Ice deception had been classified during the conflict and remained sensitive afterward because Soviet military doctrine treated deception techniques as strategic assets not to be discussed publicly. He lived until 1973, dying from illness unrelated to the blockade but certainly complicated by malnutrition that had permanently damaged his health. His obituary mentioned engineering work during the war, without specifying what that work had entailed, without explaining that he had invented methods for sculpting ice into convincing military installations, without acknowledging his role in redirecting hundreds of tons of German bombs onto frozen water. The technical documentation Korobov wrote describing ice deception procedures was preserved in Soviet military archives and declassified in 1992, 50 years after its creation. Military historians discovered the documents while researching blockade defensive innovations and were initially skeptical that the technique could have worked as described. Ice formations photographing as anti-aircraft batteries seemed implausible, seemed like the kind of desperate fantasy that siege conditions might produce, but couldn't actually succeed operationally. But German Luftwaffe records confirmed the technique's effectiveness, showed bombing missions targeting harbor ice positions, showed intelligence assessments identifying the false installations as legitimate threats worthy of ordnance expenditure. The confirmation transformed ice deception from historical curiosity to documented tactical innovation that deserved analysis and preservation. Researchers reconstructed Korobov's methods through documentation and interviews with survivors who had participated in creating the false positions. The research revealed technical sophistication that initial skepticism had dismissed. Korobov had understood photographic limitations and exploited them systematically, had recognized that aerial reconnaissance transformed three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional images that could be manipulated if you understood how cameras recorded depth and shadow, had developed practical techniques for creating deceptions under operational constraints that made perfection impossible but made sufficient accuracy achievable. The Leningrad harbor, where Korobov conducted his first ice deception, is now fully functional port facility with no visible trace of wartime activity. The buildings Korobov used as observation positions were demolished during post-war reconstruction, replaced with structures that serve modern shipping operations without historical markers acknowledging what happened there. The harbor ice where German bombs fell exists only in winter and melts every spring, recreating the temporary surface conditions that made deception possible, but erasing any physical trace of the craters that proved the technique's success. A small museum in what is now St. Petersburg preserves photographs of ice deception installations, displays showing how water spray created false military positions, technical documentation explaining Korobov's methods. The museum receives modest attendance, mostly local residents and military history enthusiasts who understand the blockade's significance. The ice deception display is one exhibit among dozens covering various aspects of the siege, given attention proportional to its operational importance, but not elevated to prominence above other desperate innovations that kept Leningrad functioning through 900 days of systematic destruction. Korobov's technique represented specific form of defensive deception unique to blockade conditions and winter warfare. Ice provided temporary construction material that could be shaped quickly existed naturally in quantities sufficient for large-scale deception, required no supply chain or manufacturing infrastructure beyond water pumps and hoses. The material's temporary nature was advantage rather than limitation. Deceptions that melted in spring couldn't be analyzed by German ground forces, couldn't be examined in ways that would reveal construction techniques, automatically reset every winter when new ice provided fresh canvas for continued deception. The technique exploited conditions that existed nowhere except besieged cities during winter, was innovation born from specific intersection of environmental factors and tactical necessity. Other besieged Soviet cities attempted to replicate Korobov's methods with mixed success. Sevastopol employed ice deception during its siege, but found the technique less effective because warmer climate meant less reliable ice formation. Stalingrad tried similar deceptions, but discovered that German reconnaissance procedures had already adapted to account for false positions, that the Luftwaffe had learned to verify installations through multiple observation methods before committing ordnance. The technique's effectiveness degraded as German intelligence adapted, as initial surprise gave way to systematic countermeasures, as tactical innovation became expected rather than novel. But even degraded effectiveness was valuable, created uncertainty that German targeting had to account for, forced Luftwaffe reconnaissance to expend additional resources, verifying potential targets, slowed the bombing campaign's efficiency in ways that mattered during critical operations. Deception's value wasn't purely measured in bombs redirected, but in operational tempo reduced, in intelligence collection complicated, in targeting confidence degraded. Ice deception made German bombing less accurate and less efficient even after the Luftwaffe understood the technique, because understanding deception and countering deception completely were different challenges requiring different resources. The physics Korobov exploited remain valid. Water spray freezes into formations that photograph convincingly from altitude if constructed with understanding of how cameras record three-dimensional space. Modern reconnaissance technology would detect his deceptions easily through thermal imaging or radar analysis or multispectral photography. But in 1942, those technologies didn't exist operationally, and German reconnaissance relied on visual photography that could be deceived by ice sculpture. The technique was perfectly calibrated to exploit Luftwaffe limitations as they existed in that specific historical moment, was innovation that worked because it matched technological constraints and tactical procedures that would change but hadn't changed yet. Korobov's legacy is preserved primarily in military deception doctrine that acknowledges his contribution to understanding how reconnaissance can be misled through environmental manipulation. His work influenced Cold War deception strategies that employed similar principles adapted to different technologies and contexts, influenced thinking about how defensive positions could be concealed or falsified to complicate enemy targeting. The specific technique of ice deception became obsolete, but the underlying insight that reconnaissance systems can be exploited if you understand their limitations remained relevant through subsequent decades of evolving military technology. The German analysts who were deceived by Korobov's ice formations left no detailed records explaining their failure to recognize the deceptions initially. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from the period show confident assessments of Leningrad's defensive positions, show targeting recommendations that included harbor installations later revealed as false, show no indication that analysts suspected systematic deception until physical evidence confirmed it months later. The analysts were competent professionals executing standard procedures, examining reconnaissance photographs with attention trained by experience, applying doctrine developed through years of operational practice. They failed to identify ice deception, not because of incompetence, but because the deception exploited expectations they had no reason to question. The failure reveals fundamental challenge in intelligence analysis. Distinguishing real from false requires suspecting falsification, requires applying skepticism that slows analysis and reduces confidence, even when examining legitimate information. German analysts could have identified Korobov's deceptions by treating every installation as potentially fake, by requiring extensive verification before declaring any position legitimate. But that approach would have made intelligence collection impossibly slow and would have generated false negatives that excluded real positions from targeting. The practical solution was accepting some deception risk in exchange for analysis speed, was acknowledging that some bombs would be wasted on false targets as cost of maintaining operational tempo that couldn't accommodate perfect verification. Korobov understood this trade-off and designed his deceptions to exploit it systematically. He created false positions that looked sufficiently legitimate to pass rapid analysis, that included enough detail to satisfy cursory verification, that could only be revealed as false through investigation intensive enough to slow intelligence production unacceptably. His deceptions weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be good enough to survive the level of scrutiny German analysts could practically apply given time constraints and analysis volume. The technique worked because it understood enemy procedures and created deceptions calibrated precisely to pass those procedures without triggering additional investigation. The harbor ice formations were artworks in sense that art involves creating visual effects that produce specific responses in observers. Korobov was sculpting ice to create images that would deceive cameras and analysts, was manipulating water and cold to produce forms that existed purely to be misinterpreted. The artistic dimension was purely instrumental. Beauty or creativity mattered only insofar as they contributed to convincing deception. But the creative process involved aesthetic decisions about proportion and shadow and detail that artists would recognize as familiar concerns addressed in different context. The teams who implemented Korobov's designs became skilled at ice sculpture through practice that had nothing to do with artistic expression and everything to do with military necessity. They learned to control water pressure and spray patterns with precision that produced specific visual effects, learned to build up ice formations that achieved exact shadow angles and texture depths. Their skill was measured in successful deceptions rather than aesthetic appreciation, was validated through German bombing targeting their creations rather than through any artistic recognition. But the skill was real, and the creative problem-solving was genuine, and the work required visual sensitivity that other forms of military engineering didn't demand. Korobov's innovation emerged from siege desperation that made conventional solutions impossible and forced creative alternatives. Leningrad couldn't build additional anti-aircraft guns, couldn't move existing positions without revealing them to reconnaissance, couldn't prevent German observation that guided bombing with devastating accuracy. The engineering challenge was protecting positions without construction resources, defending territory without additional weapons, surviving bombardment without fortifications that might stop explosives. Ice deception solved that challenge by changing what German reconnaissance observed, by creating false reality that cameras recorded and analysts believed, by making the Luftwaffe bomb installations that didn't exist rather than installations that did. The solution worked because it addressed the actual problem rather than the problem as conventionally defined. Conventional defensive engineering focused on physical protection, building bunkers, digging positions, hardening installations against attack. Korobov recognized that physical protection wasn't achievable with available resources, and that the actual problem wasn't surviving bombs, but preventing bombs from being targeted accurately. If German reconnaissance couldn't identify real positions, bombs couldn't be targeted effectively. If reconnaissance could be deceived into identifying false positions, bombs could be redirected away from real targets. The insight shifted defensive strategy from passive protection to active deception, from trying to survive attack to preventing accurate targeting. The shift represented broader pattern in siege warfare, where resource constraints forced innovations that conventional military doctrine didn't anticipate. Blockaded cities couldn't operate according to standard procedures because standard procedures assumed supply chains and replacement resources that blockade eliminated. Innovation became survival requirement, and survival requirement produced desperate creativity that sometimes yielded techniques valuable enough to preserve beyond their immediate context. Ice deception was one such technique, was desperate improvisation that worked well enough to document and replicate, that revealed principles about reconnaissance deception applicable beyond its specific implementation. Korobov never considered himself innovator or creative problem solver, considered himself engineer doing necessary work under impossible conditions. The ice deception technique seemed obvious to him once he recognized that frozen harbor surfaces photographed as potential installation sites seemed like straightforward application of physics and photographic principles to tactical challenge. That the technique hadn't been attempted previously didn't strike him as evidence of innovation, but as evidence that circumstances hadn't previously aligned to make it necessary. Siege created necessity, and winter provided materials, and German reconnaissance procedures created vulnerability. He simply recognized the convergence and acted on opportunity that conditions presented. His humility about the innovation was characteristic of blockade survivors who generally resisted characterizing their desperate adaptations as heroic or creative. Survival required constant improvisation, and improvisation required constant creativity, but acknowledging creativity felt like claiming virtue for actions that circumstances demanded. Everyone in Leningrad was improvising constantly because conventional approaches to basic survival had become impossible. Korobov's ice deception was one improvisation among thousands, notable for military impact, but not fundamentally different from civilian innovations that kept people alive through starvation and cold and bombardment. The distinction between military innovation and survival adaptation blurred during blockade, where all activity served defense regardless of civilian or military classification. Korobov worked as military engineer, but his techniques protected civilians by reducing bombing accuracy, by making German air raids less effective against defensive positions that ultimately protected the population. Civilian survival depended on military defense, and military defense depended on civilian support, and the entire system functioned as integrated entity, where innovation anywhere could affect outcomes everywhere. Ice deception saved military positions, but the positions saved were protecting civilians, and the technique was possible because civilian water infrastructure could be adapted to spray patterns that created false installations. The blockade's integration of military and civilian spheres produced innovations that conventional war didn't generate, because conventional war maintained clearer boundaries between combatant and non-combatant, between military necessity and civilian support. Leningrad's siege eliminated those boundaries practically, if not legally, made everyone participant in defensive operations regardless of official role, made every resource potentially military asset regardless of intended purpose. Korobov's water pumps and hoses were civilian infrastructure repurposed for military deception, were tools designed for industrial use adapted to tactical requirement, were example of how blockade forced total mobilization that found military applications for civilian systems. The moral complexity of ice deception was minimal compared to other wartime innovations, but still present. Korobov's technique caused German bombs to fall on empty ice rather than military positions, which meant the bombs exploded harmlessly rather than killing Soviet defenders. But the bombs would have been dropped regardless. Korobov didn't increase German bombing, he redirected existing attacks. The technique saved Soviet lives without directly causing additional German casualties beyond the opportunity costs of wasted ordnance. The moral calculus was unusually clean for wartime innovation, was defensive measure that prevented death without directly causing it, was tactical advantage gained through intelligence rather than violence. But the technique's success meant German bombing continued longer because the Luftwaffe believed their attacks were effective when they were actually being deceived. If German intelligence had recognized ice deception immediately, they might have adjusted tactics, or reduced bombing tempo, or reallocated resources. Korobov's success paradoxically extended the bombing campaign he was defending against, though the alternative, allowing accurate targeting of real positions, would certainly have been worse. The ethical complexity was subtle but real, was example of how defensive innovations in total war created second-order effects that complicated simple moral classifications. Korobov's work ended with Leningrad's liberation, but his techniques continued influencing military deception doctrine through subsequent decades. His documentation of ice deception procedures was studied at Soviet military academies as example of how environmental conditions could be exploited for tactical advantage, how reconnaissance systems could be deceived through understanding their technical limitations, how desperate circumstances could generate innovations that conventional thinking didn't anticipate. The specific technique became historical artifact, but the analytical approach remained relevant as reconnaissance technology evolved and new vulnerabilities emerged that creative deception might exploit. The legacy is preserved in Russian military doctrine that treats deception as fundamental defensive capability rather than peripheral tactic, that trains officers to identify enemy reconnaissance vulnerabilities and develop countermeasures exploiting those vulnerabilities. Korobov's insight that reconnaissance systems can be misled if you understand how they process information became foundational principle that influenced Soviet and later Russian military thinking about defensive operations. The principle transcended its specific implementation in ice sculpture, became abstract concept applicable to different technologies and tactical situations. The harbor ice where Korobov created his first deceptions forms and melts annually. Temporary surface that exists during winter months when Neva River freezes solid. The ice forms naturally now without military purpose is used for fishing and ice roads and winter recreation rather than deception operations. The transition from military necessity to civilian normalcy is complete and unremarked, is example of how wartime innovations become historical artifacts that physical environment doesn't preserve. The ice remembers nothing, and the harbor has no markers acknowledging what happened there, and the bombing craters that once proved deception's effectiveness melted 75 years ago, leaving no trace except archival photographs and technical documentation. Korobov's innovation was possible because 19th-century engineering understood ice physics well enough to manipulate frozen water deliberately, because 20th-century photography had limitations that visual deception could exploit, because German tactical procedures relied heavily on reconnaissance photography that processed images according to learnable patterns. The convergence of these factors created temporary window where ice deception worked operationally, where desperate innovation could succeed because technology and tactics hadn't yet evolved to counter it. The window closed as photography improved and verification procedures adapted, but during its opening the technique saved positions and lives in quantities that justified its development and deployment. The engineer who improvised deception using frozen water and understanding of how cameras recorded shadow and depth survived the war and returned to civilian work, and died without recognition beyond military records that remained classified for 50 years after his innovation proved operationally significant. The ice formations he created existed only to be destroyed, were successful precisely because German bombs obliterated them, were artifacts that proved their worth through disappearance rather than preservation. The technique he developed worked because it understood limitation rather than capability, because it exploited what reconnaissance couldn't verify rather than what it could observe, because it recognized that seeing and understanding weren't identical, and that gap between them could be manipulated by engineer with water and cold and desperate necessity.